For millennia, humans have made distinctions between each other for the purpose of organizing groups and putting one group against the other to develop or maintain power. The concept of race, though, is a modern construct. It's only been in existence for around 600 years. And it's very important to understand this concept of race within the context of the issue of reparations. Let's go back to about 1441, after Pope Martin V commissioned Prince Henry of Portugal to begin the invasion of Africa. During this time, the Catholic Church started a process that culminated with Pope Julius II when he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Holy Family in the Sistine Chapel, and he used his uncle's wife, and their son as the model. During this Renaissance period, it was a recasting of the images of history. So it turned the iconography of the church from Black images, which had existed for the prior 1400 years, to white images. And also, along with the church developing this and financing the beginning of the plunder of Africa and the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Very interestingly, the church used a passage from the Bible about the curse of Canaan to suggest that Black people were Black because of the curse of Canaan. This actually was something written in the Jewish Talmud, and it became a philosophy to attempt to justify the plunder of Africa and the destruction of Black people, and classifying Black people as an inferior group. And so by the 15th century, the early 1500s, the Pope Julius II had commissioned Bartholomew de la Casa to begin the slave trade on behalf of the church. And also the so-called cotton modder used passages from the scripture, which basically said that they used a passage that said that as everyone knows that that man is made in the image of God. And as everyone knows, God is not a Negro. Therefore, the Negro is not a man. And they used this syllogism as a way to justify to white people, because the ordinary white person, there had been a history in Europe where Blacks were rulers. Blacks were the kings and princes, and they brought civilization to Europe. All over Southern Europe, when you look at the history of all of those countries, you see Black leaders there who brought civilization, who brought consciousness, who brought education, who brought trades, who brought knowledge, and brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. And that's a complete study in and of itself. But it becomes very significant because what happened is you get a campaign of defamation against Black people to try to justify the evil of slavery. And over a period of time, a number of different doctrines developed in the European academic community. For example, they came up with something called the Teutonic origins theory, which said that the only people endowed with the wisdom and knowledge to build stable government was the Teutonic tribes of Germany, and that all of the peoples of Europe were the descendants of the Teutonic tribes, and that they were in fact the superior race. Of course, we know that all the people of Europe were not descendants of the Teutonic tribes, and this theory was just simply a myth created to justify the atrocities that were being committed against Black people. They also developed something called the doctrine of phrenology. And phrenology was supposed to be, it was a pseudoscience that was based upon a supposed study of the head shapes of people. And they looked at the heads of Africans and said that Africans were a subhuman race because of their head shape. Of course, this was a false doctrine that was created, but it was used in academia. And at the time, it helped to justify slavery to ordinary white people whose morality opposed slavery. And so there was always a conflict within the white community over the issue of slavery and man's inhumanity to man, white people's inhumanity to man. And so we can go and look further, and we see the Johann Blumenbach came up just before the founding of the United States. He came up with a theory of polygenesis, and he said that man had multiple origins and that there was a white race, a black race, a yellow race, a brown race, and a red race, and that the white was the most beautiful race. And he attempted to use this doctrine to justify and create a classification system, a racial classification system. This was the first really true classification system that came into being that continues to exist today. Before, it was very convoluted. But what they did was they came up with a way to argue that that whites were the superior race. Charles Darwin later came out with a theory of monogenesis, and he established through empirical evidence that there was no polygenesis and that man originated from one set of human parents, and that the skin color, hair texture, hair color, eye color, that all these morphological differences were superficial and were the result of climatic conditions and were man adapted to his environment in different climates. And so, this became very significant in terms of the debate over the issue of race. In Britain, there was something called the Piltdown scandal that took place in the early 1900s, where they planted a fake skull in Piltdown, England, and retrieved this fake skull that actually was a monkey skull. And they used this skull to say that they found the oldest fossil remains of man in Europe, in England, and that man originated in England. And therefore, the British people and white Europeans were a superior race. So these are the kinds of theories that were put forth that were designed to poison the minds and mislead white people. They weren't directed toward Black people. They were directed toward white people in order to justify slavery, because there was a growing discontent over man's inhumanity to man. And slavery in America was different than any other form of slavery that existed in the history of mankind. Never before in the history of mankind was there a form of chattel slavery where man's humanity was denied, and where Black people were relegated to the status of chattels, of property. And all other forms of slavery all around the world, there was always a way out of slavery. It wasn't a permanent status. And people came into slavery as a result of war. They came into slavery through various different means, through debt. But never before were people assigned to be slaves on the basis of their skin color. And that's the distinguishing feature about slavery in America, and what makes it different than any other form of slavery that's ever existed in the history of man in any country on the earth. And so in terms of looking at this thing and understanding our history and looking at the issue of reparations, it's very important that we begin to understand some of the foundations and doctrines that backed the issue of slavery, and were used to justify slavery, because there are many people still today who are influenced by these false doctrines and that reject the equality of man that was written in the United States Constitution. The founders of this country recognized the equality of man. And even though slavery was a reality at the time, and even though there was a massive resistance to equality, and even though some of the founders were slave owners at the time, they recognized and understood that this condition was a temporary condition and that it could not last forever, and that the human rights of Black people would have to ultimately be recognized, and that science itself would establish the fact of the equality of man. And so, I wanted to share those thoughts, because when we look at this issue of reparations and talk about and discuss reparations, it's extremely important for us to begin to understand that race itself is a mental construct. It is based on a false doctrine, based on false information. It is a lie, and it is designed to create division, to create hatred, and to create fear that will keep humanity separated and in conflict with each other.